Right. So I'm starting. So anybody else? That's all.
Yes, sir.
Anybody else to come? Nothing. They may come. We don't know.
They might come, sir. I'll just let you know, sir, when they come.
Right. Because 2 weeks, last week I was on service, so a bit busy, and the last before week I couldn't do it. Anyhow, so we'll do it in like 3 parts, motor examination. Okay.
Okay.
So Jasir and Vidya is their exam going out there, and Kalim is there. Right. So I think most of you, because you are the senior most batches, you all will be aware of what I'm going to talk. Nothing too much complicated. So if the entire neurological examination can be done in a schematic way, and if you can remember maybe this mnemonic, these are the headings which we usually do. And last time, Kalim, I think you had the opportunity to see Kaushik's class, actually, higher mental function.
I just
Took it, huh?
only little part. Jasper had attended full.
Right. He's a very good teacher, like actually. So he used to be my junior. Kaushik is good. So Kaushik told about higher mental function. Okay. So the system is like psych, higher mental function, motor examination, reflexes coordination, sensory gait, skull and spine, trophic changes, and bladder. Now, if you know carefully, sometimes in a OPD setting, we may do these examinations in just 4 to 5 minutes. So there is something like a neurological screening examination where for a specific case, I may decide to do only a specific aspect of neurological examination. But for students, it is important that they do everything in a sequence and try practicing as much as possible, right from higher mental function to the bladder function. So when I put this 10 topics, some of you may think that how it is possible to complete all these detailed neurological examination within 15-20 minutes or half an hour that you have for examinations, right? So that is a challenge. If you're able to do it everything in a sequence, practice again and again, you may be able to skip certain examination, and especially in children, we may skip certain things or we may do out of sequence as well. For example, we do the most painful part of the examination at the end, like sensory examination or doing the reflexes, and whatever is possible in the beginning we can do it. Okay, so this is just the mnemonic to remember pH, MRCS, GST, bladder, so and so that you know that this is the sequence that we need to complete the entire neuro axis. So I would want to do the motor examination in 3 parts. The first part is just about bulk and tone. The second part should be about the examination of power and techniques of examination, power and strength. And the third part should be reflexes. So this is how I intend to do. Okay, so just 1 second. Probably I'll mute you also. So I'm getting some sound. Can you mute yourself, Kalim? Hello? Yeah, thanks, Kalim. Okay, fine. Right. So as you know that a good neurological examination, if there is any doubt in between, you can put in the chat box. So I'll be knowing, is there any chat or anything like that? Okay. So the neurological medicine is different from other parts of medicine in that it is based upon anatomical model. You need to have some anatomical idea where the lesion is. And then we think about etiology, unlike other systems of medicine where there is very much emphasis on the etiology right from the beginning. For example, if you have a skin abscess, it is not important where the skin abscess is, that you will be usually thinking what is the etiology behind the skin abscess. Is it infection or it is an immunological cause? Whereas in neurological scenario, if there is a weakness, we would always be thinking where is this weakness first? It is upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron, or combined. So suffice to say, a good history taking and examination would give a fair idea about where is the lesion, and then you subsequently think what could be the type of the lesion. Okay, so we will look for the motor examination, of which, as I said, we'll just focus on bulk and the tone today. Okay, so as you know, the CAPE model, that is clinical, anatomical, and etiological. The focus here is on clinical. I'm not going to talk about anything about anatomy or etiology in this particular session. I'll just focus upon the clinical examination and steps. So in the outline of this presentation, the 3 headings that I would like to do is observation, palpation, percussion, and performing maneuvers. Right? Observation, palpation, percussion, and performing certain maneuvers. So what do we observe? We observe The posture, right from a time a child walks into the outpatient department, you see the way he stands, you see the way he sits, he walks, what are the posture of his limbs, how are his faces, is there any clues from his faces, the way he looks, how are his generalized movements, whether they are symmetric, whether they are asymmetric, whether the quality of movements is decreased or it is increased, how is his body contour, whether he's thin or whether he's fat, right, whether he's more muscular, whether he's thin, etc. So observation is very important, gives lots of information, and sometimes just by simple observation for 5 to 10 minutes you may able to reach a diagnosis. Palpation, percussion, just like we do in a surgery session, it's about observation or inspection, palpation, percussion, and performing certain maneuvers. So you palpate and percuss the muscle consistency and the muscle tone. I'll come to that again. And then we perform certain maneuvers. We perform certain steps in the examination to give an idea about the tone or the power and the reflexes. So the part one would be more about tone and the range of motion. And the part two, we can talk about power and the reflexes. So what do we see from the observation of this child, right? It is important that every student starts developing his observation skills. I mean, almost in every session I tell this. The observation should be unobtrusive, without any stress on you or the stress on the kid or the stress on the family. Better you allow the child to just play, and always have a sequence in your mind. You can have a sequence from head to toe, and you can always compare between right side and left side. It is always important that you undress all children for better examination. Most of the time if you undress, you may get certain clues. Okay, we may think what the child may feel, but you know, anybody who comes to the OPD is actually mentally prepared for him to be examined. Okay, so they are not that much concerned. That we are probably more concerned than the patients or than the children for undressing a particular thing. Okay, even here, okay, I see that the residents generally don't undress a child, and they just start having a vague look. But the moment you undress, you get a lot of clues. Take time and ponder just before touching the child, right? See whether there is any pattern just by the way you look at it. It's a very good mental exercise. The more you try this, you know, and you just think, okay, this probably looks like this particular type of a neurological condition. Okay, and then start examining. It gives more information. Okay, and sometimes you need to observe a child 2-3 times, and these days with the help of mobile videos, okay, you can ask them to make videos and come back and show to you the child is not allowing you to examine in your OPD. So what do we observe? We observe the general physical examination, which could be the facial examination, the skin finding, the eye finding, the posture of how he looks like, of how the child is in sleeping posture, sitting posture. Okay, how is the back, how are the legs, how are the hands, is there flex, are they adducted, is there any scissoring when you look like, is there any frog like abducted hips, is there any obvious deformities in your posture, is there any obvious contractions that you can see either proximally or distally, or in the right side or in the left side. Always go in a sequence from head to toe. It's easy if you go in a sequence rather than just looking randomly. Is there any laxity of joints, and how is the bulk of the muscles overall? So we'll be just going by one by one. I'll be showing lots of images from this point, images of the faces, of the deformities and contractures and so on. So personally, as I already told before, I believe that probably a good observation is very, very helpful as a clinician to improve your diagnostic skills. So all of you know that this particular, even just a phenotype can give a clue that, okay, I see a child who has a mongoloid slant, has a white sandal gaps. So I know this, I expect this child to show hypotonia or a decrease in tone. And here again, I see a child who's having a bit of hypopigmented hair, he's obese, okay, probably, and he's having this almond shaped ears. So he's a Prader-Willi syndrome. So again, I expect the child to show tonal abnormality. So a well-defined dysmorphism or facial phenotypes right in the beginning. For example, if you see a child with Edwards syndrome, rocker bottom feet, with fisted hands, okay, or overlapping of fingers and toes, you may expect spasticity in the child. So a good amount of observation is crucial. Like if you see a child who doesn't seem to move his hands and legs, but is like very alert and very actively looking at you. This is a very classical faces of an SMA child who has a very alert faces, versus a child who's looking very dull with minimal facial expression. The mouth is open, it's a long face with a V-shaped mouth, with a low set ears. You know, this is probably a myopathic faces. So we have a child who's equally or perhaps more weak, but is having such a good facial expression and so alert, sometimes smiling well, is a typical SMA baby, versus a child who has a myopathic long faces and looks very dumb and dull. Right? So you have otherwise again a child who's having a long faces with typical bitemporal hollowing, suggest it could be a myotonic dystrophy. So suffice to say, all of you know this, a child who is alert and intubated in the ICU, showing this typical type of rapid tongue quivering like movements at rest, is your tongue fasciculations. Okay, can be seen whenever there is an anterior horn cell involvement, like in a spinal muscular atrophy or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis in bigger children. Right, a faces, I think I've shown this video in so many sessions, a faces which is more staring and more fixed, more snarl-like faces of facial myotonia seen in Schwartz-Jampel syndrome. So just the faces gives an idea, okay, that this is this particular condition, right? Different type of faces for paroxysomal disorder, faces for congenital disorders of glycosylation, faces for congenital myopathy, and so on. Always look at the deformities. The deformities can indicate either very severe multiple congenital anomalies, can in this situation probably indicate a skeletal dysplasias, or can indicate a neurological abnormalities like a neurogenic club foot, right? If you have very specific contractures, for example, this type of a distal contractures, finger contractures is seen in a congenital myasthenia gravis, certain types, right? So can give a clue. Just look at the deformities. Also helps in you to decide to refer to a pediatric orthopedician or to a rehabilitation specialist. Deformities can also involve the chest wall, which is known as pectus excavatum in certain muscle conditions. Okay, you can see inverted nipples in certain hypotonic children. You can see a high arched palate in certain muscle conditions. Hyperlaxicity of joints can be seen in congenital muscular dystrophies like Ullrich muscular dystrophy. Okay, so motor examination has a very wide anatomical basis. It could be your upper motor, lower motor, it could be spinal cord, etc. So almost many conditions can be included as a part of your general physical examination. So this is one example of a child who's having proximal as well as a distal joint laxicity. If you can see the face is very dull with a V-shaped mouth and cup-shaped ears. But when you further examine, you have this very typical hyperlaxicity of joints, right? A broad thumb. Okay, any diagnosis here? So the moment you see long faces, you know probably it's a myopathic, or a myopathy is high on cards. But the moment you see this extensive joint hyperlaxicity, right, and with a very typical velvety palm or a soft palm, you know it's a type of a congenital muscular dystrophy called Ullrich muscular dystrophy. So the gestalt here gives an idea. The eye examination in this case, for example, that's a bilateral sixth nerve palsy causing adduction of the eye with a very bland face with very limited expression. You may think it's a congenital myopathy, but this is a Mobius syndrome, which has ophthalmoparesis and facial diplegia. So similarly, you can see ophthalmoparesis with congenital myasthenia gravis and congenital myopathies. Okay, certain floppy babies can have certain clues, like cataract can be seen in paroxysmal disorders. Pigmented retinopathy can be seen in paroxysmal or mitochondrial disorders. Lens dislocation can be seen in molybdenum cofactor deficiency, and so on. Skin examination, again, it is very extensive. Some of them which comes to my mind is generalized ichthyosis, which you can see with spasticity syndromes like leukodystrophies, very specifically Sjogren-Larsen syndrome. Extensive Mongolian spoids with coarse facial features and with hernia. You can expect a child who is hypotonic in a case of GM1 gangliosidosis. You can see like this multiple subcutaneous nodules in a case of a Farber syndrome, and they can have peripheral neuropathies associated or painful neuropathies associated. So the clue is numerous to be listed in one particular session, but I'm just giving a glance of ideas. Okay. So most importantly, once you finish your general physical examination, the eyes, the nystagmus, okay, okay, what you want to do is proper measurement of the muscle bulk. So muscle bulk measurement is part of examination. What you know is that they are done at specific areas. For example, it is usually done around 10 centimeters above the patella to 10 centimeters below, 10 centimeters below the olecranon process, and so on. So you measure the muscle girth at fixed points, okay, and measure. It should be like 1 or 2 centimeters between two sides is okay, but any cross asymmetry should be thought of as a pathology, okay, limited to that particular limb, okay. So when you see the muscle bulk, generally children are thin built, but you can have either obesity or you can have a very muscular phenotype sometimes, or you can have a generalized atrophy. So what is important here is that as you undress, you need to see how the bulk looks overall. Is there any difference? Any asymmetry is important, or if the bulk is affected in only certain groups of muscles. So one of the biggest clue whether it is a muscle issue or a nerve issue is the distribution of the bulk differences like atrophy or hypertrophy in specific groups of muscles. Okay, so the first question is whether the bulk is affected overall, whether it is generalized or whether it is focal. If it is focal, which is the muscle group which is affected? Is it the distal muscle group or the proximal muscle group or any specific set of muscle group which is affected? Like this child is having congenital hypothyroidism. This is known as Kochre-Sabre syndrome, isn't it? Kochre-Debagré-Sabre syndrome, right? Okay, where you can see a generalized hypertrophy all throughout, posteriorly as well as anteriorly. This is a child who's having a generalized hypertrophy of muscles because of severe hypothyroidism. Similarly, if you see a generalized muscular phenotype like a Hercules body, Hercules is a Greek god, in a small child as if he's having a six-pack muscle, good firm stiff muscles, okay, with a pursed mouth, this can indicate a specific type of a congenital myotonia called as Thompson's disease, and this particular sign is known as Hercules sign. Now, all of you know this particular condition where there is a focal atrophy in certain areas, like you have the atrophy in the calf muscles, hypertrophy in the calf muscles, hypertrophy in the deltoid muscles, hypertrophy in the tongue, hypertrophy in the infraspinatus. These type of specific hypertrophy of muscles in the deltoid muscles and so is seen in certain muscular dystrophies. So whenever you have a group hypertrophy, there are certain muscles are predisposed to be hypertrophied in certain muscular dystrophy conditions. Like Duchenne muscular dystrophy could have hypertrophy of the calf, the deltoid, the tongue muscles, the infraspinatus, and so. Right? There is a biggest clue that this could be Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Similar calf hypertrophy can also be seen in other conditions like severe hypothyroidism. It can be seen in limb girdle muscular dystrophy. It can be seen in type 3 SMA as well. Okay. So just the presence of calf hypertrophy does not mean a Duchenne muscular hypertrophy. But with the calf hypertrophy, if you have a very typical proximal hip girdle weakness, like we have the very classical Gower sign, there are multiple steps in Gower sign. As you can see, a child has to turn prone, okay, will use his hands to climb upon himself. He will form this V-shaped position like this, a V shape, okay, and then he will fix his knees and then he will climb upon his knees. This is known as a Gower sign, and he has to abduct his legs, okay, to have a better balance. Okay, this particular maneuver is because of a weak hip extensors and a weak knee extensors. Okay, so the hip extensors, the back extensors, and the knee extensors, and in order to stabilize the knee, he needs to climb upon himself. In order to stabilize his back, he needs to stabilize himself. So this is your typical Gower sign. So the more time he takes, you can count the Gower sign. You can note this sign every time he comes for a follow-up. Okay, so a Gower time in which is more than 10 to 15 seconds is usually very bad, which means the child needs more time to stand up and ambulate himself, right? So this is seen in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So this is because of hip abductors with trunk extensor weakness. So Gower sign is because of a trunk extensor, knee extensors, and hip abductor weakness. If the child is made to lie supine, he would first turn himself prone, use his hands to support himself, okay, and climb upon the knees. So this is known as your Gower sign. Right. Now, this is important because there are other conditions where you can see calf hypertrophy. So the other muscular dystrophies where the CPK is very high is known as limb girdle dystrophy. So there is also one more sign in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and this is known as Valley sign. This is known as a Valley sign. Now, what happens in Valley sign is that there is hypertrophy of the deltoid muscle and there is hypertrophy of the infraspinatus, but the posterior fold of the axilla formed by latissimus dorsi and the triceps is atrophied. So this gives rise to a deep depression in the fold, deep depression in the posterior axillary fold. So between these two mounts, there's a depression. That's why it's called as a valley. So this valley sign can also be seen in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So as I told you about limb girdle muscular dystrophies, there are so many limb girdle muscular dystrophies. Okay, like examples are sarcoglycanopathy and dysferlinopathy and calpanopathy and so and so. But for a postgraduate student, okay, they just need to know that a calf hypertrophy can also be seen in other limb girdle muscular dystrophies. But unlike in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where the hip abductors are involved, in other limb girdle muscular dystrophy, it is the hip adductors or the quadriceps which is involved. Okay, like in this case, there's a sign called as diamond on the quadriceps sign, which is seen in a particular limb girdle muscular dystrophy called dysferlinopathy. This is because of a focal atrophy and focal hypertrophy of the quadriceps muscles. So this involvement of quadriceps muscles is very characteristic of dysferlinopathy. Okay, so you can see this type of findings, okay, in certain types of limb girdle muscular dystrophy. Remember that, limb girdle muscular dystrophy. So one sign which can look like a Gower is called as hip abduction sign. This is seen in one type of limb girdle muscular dystrophy called sarcoglycanopathy. Here also the children may have calf hypertrophy, but when you ask them to get up, their hip abductors are good. So they will abduct their hips, keep it at 90 degree like this, use their hip abductor strength to climb up. So this can look like a Gower, but this is not a Gower sign. Okay, you saw the difference between the two. In the other one, they have to bend their backs like a triangle and then climb up. Here, he will bend his hips at 90 degree like this, use his hip abductors to climb up. So in a sarcoglycanopathy, it is the hip adductors which is weak and the hip abductors is normal. A sarcoglycanopathy can also have a calf hypertrophy. So in a Duchenne muscular dystrophy, it is the hip abductors which is weak. In a sarcoglycanopathy, it is the hip adductors that is weak. So a hip abduction sign, okay, some of you may rarely get a child which can looks like a Duchenne, but it is not a Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So there is again dysferlinopathy can have atrophies of multiple groups of muscles. Here the deltoid is more prominent, atrophy of the posterior fold of axilla. You can look like as if there is a calf head on a trophy sign. So these sort of focal atrophies can be seen in muscular dystrophies. So for a postgraduate student, just remember, if you are seeing some funny hypertrophy and funny atrophy of muscles, think about muscular dystrophies like limb girdle muscular dystrophies. So this is very, very important. Okay, here the CPK may not be that much elevated, but you see there'll be bilateral facial weakness. He will not be able to blow his buccinator. When you ask to close his eyelids, okay, he may not be able to bury his eyelids. And there is a significant scapular winging. So that's a facial weakness, there's a scapul weakness, and there is a humeral weakness, right? And this is known as facioscapular humeral atrophy. Okay. So here the biceps may be very weak, whereas the forearm muscles are very much hypertrophied. And so in that situation, you have a forearm which can look like a Popeye, the Popeye sailor sign. So it is known as a Popeye sign. Okay. So this child has a facioscapular humeral dystrophy where there's atrophy of biceps, but hypertrophy of the forearm muscles. You can remember that. So what are the difference between atrophies? So atrophy again can be generalized like in malnutrition, but you have atrophy in specific groups, especially like a distal atrophy. It could be a neurogenic distal atrophy or a myogenic distal atrophy. What is the difference? In a neurogenic atrophy, the weakness and the wasting are proportionate. Whereas in a myogenic atrophy, some distal muscular dystrophies can cause wasting in the distal muscles. In a myogenic atrophy, the weakness is the weakness and wasting are not proportion. Okay, the weakness is more than the wasting. Whereas in a neurogenic atrophy, the weakness and the wasting are proportionate to each other. Okay, I just need 1 minute. I think is Kalim there? Can Kalim unmute himself? Wait. Yeah, Kalim?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it is showing me that I have to upgrade my Zoom other because of time limit or something. Maybe I just not upgraded it. It is showing only I have
Okay.
8 minutes available.
Okay.
So can I pause and I sort of
7 o'clock.
stop share and come back again, sort of upgrade and come back?
Yeah, that's fine, sir.
All right, so I'm just stopping my sharing right now. Okay, and I'll come back again. Okay, right. Hello?
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
We got a message that upgraded.
Okay, fine. Right, whatever it is. Yeah. Okay, fine. Now there is no issues. Okay. Can I start?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So the atrophy, very important, is neurogenic atrophy would have the weakness and wasting which are proportional, whereas the weakness is more than the wasting in the case of a myogenic atrophy. Okay. So here we see a very typical atrophy more in the distal muscle. This is called as inverted champagne bottle appearance, more seen in a case of a neuropathy. Here again, you can see a child who has what you can see a lot of wasting, okay, of the thenar and the hypothenar muscles. You can see that most, especially these two digits, are more like flexed, okay, but there is an overall wasting, okay. If only these two digits are involved, you can have what is called as a church father sign or a Benedict sign, where the church father uses his hands for. So you can see at pes cavus, you can see the atrophy of the interossei and clawing of the toes, okay. So this particular child had this pes cavus and had the generalized distal atrophy of thenar and hypothenar eminences, but also noted was this bilateral facial weakness, okay, very poor gag, and this tongue fasciculation. So where would you localize? So once you have atrophy distally, okay, along with these fasciculations, you should understand it is probably an anterior horn cell. So this was a very rare type of a juvenile amyotrophic lateral sclerosis with lots of atrophy fasciculations, okay. So winging of scapula can be seen in many muscular dystrophies. Even it can be seen in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, limb girdle muscular dystrophy, and can be seen in a case of facioscapulohumeral dystrophy as well. Okay. So another type of atrophy where you can see a shank atrophy, that is still the deltoid muscles are okay, and below the deltoid there is a severe atrophy. This is seen in a case of a myotonic dystrophy, especially in adults, not much in children, but children can have some degree of wasting of the distal forearm and the distal legs. So myotonic dystrophy is one dystrophy which can resemble a neuropathy, right? They can have some wasting more distally. Here you can see below the deltoid there is more wasting. So this is a case of a myotonic dystrophy, and this sign is known as a shank sign. So to summarize the clue from observation, you can have dysmorphism, deformities, myopathic myasthenic phases or myotonic phases, or any other characteristic phases. You can see some joint hyperlaxicity or contractures. You can see some eye findings, and you have to analyze the muscle bulk. Is it any particular group of atrophy or hypertrophy, giving some clues of certain limb girdle muscular dystrophy, so facioscapulohumeral dystrophy or Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or it is a overall generalized hypertrophy or generalized atrophy. Right. So what are the steps of palpation percussion? So once you start examining the child, you will do a palpation. Basically, you will feel the muscles, okay? But before understanding palpation percussion, we'll just go through a brief terms which are related to tone so that we know what we are looking for. So when you start palpating and percussing the muscles and performing certain maneuvers, you want to know whether it is hypertonia, hypotonia, dystonia, okay, myotonia, paradoxical myotonia, paratonia, neuromyotonia, and all those things, okay. So for a very basic student level, we are still stuck somewhere between hypertonia and hypotonia. There are lots of mistakes. Most of them sometimes mistakes a dystonia for spasticity and so on. So at least you should be very clear between two types of hypertonia, that is spasticity and rigidity, and at least you should be very clear about the two types of hypotonia, which is a central hypotonia and a peripheral hypotonia. If you are able to pick up dystonia, if you are able to pick up myotonia and paradoxical myotonia, then that is actually great. Then you have understood neurology, right? So there can be other forms of rigidity, opisthotonus, tetanus, cramps, and so and so, right? So all these things are some of the terms which are related to tone. I'll just read out the definitions. So hypotonia is an increase in the resistance which is felt by the examiner. So what is basically tone? Let us first of all define what is tone. So all of you, if you just remember an elastic band, a rubber band. A rubber band, if you feel the rubber band, it has a rubbery feel. And if you pull the rubber band, the more you pull, the more resistant it shows to your pull. So the muscle is almost like a rubber band, okay? Intrinsically, it has some rubbery quality because of the muscle fibers and its inherent viscosity and elasticity. But if you pull the muscle fibers, it will show more features just like a rubber band. Okay, that's a normal tone. So a tone is a normal inherent resistance felt by the examiner. And if that inherent resistance, okay, is felt as increased with increasing velocity of movement of a joint by the examiner, then you call it as hypertonia. So what is hypertonia? And hypertonia is an increase in the resistance which is felt by the examiner by increasing the velocity of movements across the joint, okay? And it is more felt at the initial part of the movement. And then what is hypotonia? Hypotonia is the decreased resistance of muscles which is felt by the examiner while doing a range of movements across a joint. And what is dystonia? Dystonia is sustained or intermittent rhythmic twisting postures with the muscle tone being variable. Muscle tone sometimes can be very high or sometimes can be very less also. Then what is myotonia? Myotonia is also a stiffness of the muscle. It is a firm muscle, but myotonia here actually means even though the muscle is firm, it has a very inability to relax. So a muscle, when you contract, it has to relax. Just like I told the analogy of a rubber band. If you stretch the rubber band, it has to come back to its normal position. It has to relax. But if there's a failure of relaxation, the muscles will lie in a persistent stiff portion for much more than a longer time. Just imagine just you pulled a rubber band, it doesn't come back. So it will be remaining in the pulled position. So an inability to relax, a persistent contraction, okay, and an inability to relax the muscle is called as myotonia. And usually that relaxation is very slow. That's a slow relaxation phase. So this degree of relaxation can be improved by doing the movements repeatedly. So a child who's having myotonia or a stiffness, if you ask to do a repeated movements again and again, like supination, pronation, repeatedly, closing and opening the fingers or repeated movement of the wrist, the myotonia actually improves with repeated movements. Then what is a paradoxical myotonia? A paradoxical myotonia or a paramyotonia is that a repeated movement actually aggravates the myotonia, just like a myasthenia gravis. If you do a repeated movements, the weakness worsens. And likely in a paradoxical myotonia, if you repeat a movement like closing the fingers and opening the fingers, okay, or closing the eyes and opening the eyes, the stiffness actually worsens. That's a paradoxical myotonia. So myotonia and paradoxical myotonia can be easily differentiated by a few bedside or a OPD test. Okay. For example, if you're asking to open and close the hands again and again, if the stiffness improves, it is myotonia, and if the stiffness worsens, it is paramyotonia. Paramyotonia or paradoxical myotonia also very typically usually involves the eyelids and the face. So that's another clue. Whereas myotonia can also involve the face, but it is usually also involves more the limbs and the extremities. What is paratonia? Paratonia is an unusual phenomena seen in neurodegenerative conditions or seen in people with dementia or degenerative brain disorders because of frontal lobe dysfunction. Here in a paratonia, there's a lot of opposing response. For example, the analogy between India and let's say Pakistan. If I'm gonna say one word against Pakistan, Pakistan will say two words against me. There's a lot of fighting between each other. So it's an opposing response. So the more you try to do something, the more you will try to oppose. So this is called as a paratonia or a Gegenhalten phenomenon. Okay. So in the inhibitory response, the more the doctor is trying to do a particular movement, the more the patient will oppose that particular type of movement. That is called an inhibitory paratonia. And what is facilitatory paratonia? It is opposite. The more the patient is, the doctor is trying to do a particular movement, the more the patient will facilitate that movement. Okay, he will be more than cooperate to a particular type of a movement. That's called as a facilitatory type of paratonia. Okay, so the inhibitory paratonia is much more common than a facilitatory paratonia. This can be seen in neurodegenerative conditions. Very rarely, of course, it can be seen in very anxious children or very anxious people who are trying to oppose your particular action. What is neuromyotonia? Neuromyotonia is a painful muscle stiffness and a progressive muscle stiffness, okay, of a particular group of muscle, usually the bilateral calf or the back muscles, due to continuous firing of neurons, hyperexcitable neurons. This is extremely rare condition. I remember in Aster, I had seen one child suspected who responded to phenytoin. Okay, so neuromyotonia is usually either genetic causes or acquired causes or autoimmune causes, but extremely rare in children. It's a very painful stiffness. Only EMG can differentiate between neuromyotonia and a myotonia. Otherwise, it's clinically almost very difficult to differentiate between a neuromyotonia. It can look like a painful cramps or contracture sometimes. Okay, but a EMG shows us characteristic, high amplitude discharges, rapid firing discharges in a case of neuromyotonia. What is rigidity? So very importantly, you should know the difference between rigidity and spasticity. Spasticity is an increasing resistance with a sudden giveaway or a sudden release, whereas rigidity is a resistance to a passive movement throughout the range of motion. So in a spasticity, there is resistance in the initial part of the movement, whereas in rigidity, there is a resistance throughout the range of motion. It's very important, throughout the range of motion. Okay. And you can more appreciate rigidity when you do or when you move a joint very slowly. So if you want to appreciate spasticity, you have to move a particular joint very fast and rapid. And if you want to appreciate rigidity, you have to move a joint very slowly. Okay. And according to the nature of the feel that you get, you can have a lead pipe rigidity. It is looking as if that you are bending a lead pipe very slowly. You know, that's the feel that you get with a lead pipe rigidity. Or you can have a cogwheel rigidity, where while you are sort of bending a joint, you can have this small release movements, like a movement of a wheel. That's called as a cogwheel rigidity. That is because of a superimposed tremor along with the rigidity. So a cogwheel rigidity favors Parkinsonism disease because there is also a tremor component in addition to rigidity. What is this waxy flexibility? Waxy flexibility is seen in children, especially, I mean, if you can remember NMDA receptor encephalitis. If I keep hands in a particular position, the child tends to keep the hand or the leg in a particular position, like a doll, like a statue. Okay, almost I can bend it like a wax doll, okay, or a clay doll. So this is called as waxy flexibility, right? You can have other types of rigidity like decerebrate rigidity and decorticate rigidity in raised ICTs. Decerebrate rigidity, all of you know, it's extension of all the four limbs with marked arching of the back and posturing. Whereas decorticate rigidity is that a type of posturing when you have flexion at the level of the elbow and the wrist, and extension at the level of the hips, knees, and the ankle. Okay, so a decorticate rigidity indicates more high lesion like thalamic lesion, whereas a decerebrate is very dangerous. It indicates a lower lesion like a midbrain or a medullary lesion. Okay, so a decerebrate lesion can lead to a sudden brain death, whereas a decorticate has a much better prognosis. You can also have a localized rigidity if there is a muscle injury. You can have a rigidity over the abdomen, for example, in the case of, let's say, in a case of appendicitis, you can have a board-like rigidity of the abdominal muscles and so on. Okay. Right. So you can have tetanus. Tetanus, all of you know, it's involuntary or continuous sudden contraction of a group of muscles. Okay, usually secondary to, again, hyperexcitable neuronal discharge and calcium release. Okay, so it can look like a cramps, okay, involving a specific group of muscles, usually the distal group of muscles. And you can have spooning of the fingers. You can have a labor woman's hand and so in tetany. Okay, tetanus, if it is generalized, as you know, tetanus because of Clostridium tetani can also involve rigidity either in the face muscles, where it can produce a lockjaw or a trismus-like sign. It can produce a generalized rigidity involving the back muscles or the trunk muscles, causing opisthotonus and arching. So what are cramps? Cramps are continuous or involuntary, painful, localized contraction of the muscle group. Okay, it can be, or select muscle fibers. It can be because of metabolic reasons or calcium and so on, or because of exertion, because of loss of sodium. Everybody experiences cramps when we have high intensity exercises, right? So hyperexcitable muscles because of a neuronal discharges or alteration of the calcium or the sodium metabolism is seen in tetanus, tetany, fasciculations, contractures, myotonia, and neuromyotonia. So there is a final common pathway of hyperexcitable muscles. Only thing is, what is the inciting event can be different. Okay, so cramps, contracture, tetanus, fasciculations, all these things are hyperexcitable muscles due to various reasons. So myasthenia, all of you know, is a fatigable muscle weakness. It could be at the generalized or a specific group of muscles because impaired neuromuscular transmissions. Okay, and catatonia is again a type of a waxy flexibility which can be seen in psychiatric patients, schizophrenic patients more specifically, where they are so dull and so apathetic and so aboulia, they don't move, so they are so depressed, they have such a depressed face, and when they can keep their hands and legs in disarray postures, again like a doll. So almost it's the same as waxy flexibility. It's called as a catatonic flexibility, and they can stay in unusual postures for long time, like even for 2-3 hours. Okay, this particular feature is seen in catatonia, and that's why catatonia and waxy flexibility in children can be seen in NMDA receptor encephalitis. So when we are doing this palpation and percussion, essentially we are looking for these tone changes, whether there is hypertonia, whether there is hypotonia, whether there is spasticity, whether there is rigidity, whether there is myotonia, whether there is paradoxical myotonia, and so and so. And most of this information can be got by astute observation and performing very simple steps. So how do you start palpating the muscles? You start palpating the muscles and the joints from either a rostrocaudal, that is from above down, or from distal to rostral. Like you can start from the ankle. I generally start from the ankle. You just generally roll both the legs around the ankle and then around the knee and around the thighs, and generally feel the consistency of the muscles. Are you able to easily roll? If you're able to easily roll the muscles, it is hypotonic. If you're facing difficulty in rolling the muscles, it is probably hypertonic or more spastic. And then flex the joints and flap the joints. Just flap the distal hands and the distal toes, the palms and the soles, and see whether it is easily flappable. As you know, easily flappable can be because of hyperlaxicity of the joints, or can be because of hypotonia. Always go for rostral to caudal, head to toe. Compare the sides, right side and the left sides. See is there any difference between the truncal group of the muscles and the distal group of the muscles. So it has to be done routinely in all children, and as you know, it can be very much age dependent. All these tone changes can markedly vary in a preterm child or a term child, in a newborn child, in an infant versus a very anxious toddler. Okay, it can be state dependent also. The tone can naturally reduce if a child is sleepy or drowsy or has got some sedation, has got a midazolam medication, and so. So for that matter, we need to probably repeat it, and serial evaluation is necessary to analyze the tone. Always focus on the anatomical distribution. It's very, very important. I mean, you will say hypotonia, hypertonia, but you will not say which group of the muscles are involved. Is it proximal or distal? It is more in the trunk, or it is more in the appendicular muscles. Okay, it is more in the face, or it is more in the limbs, and so on. So always comment on which group the tone is affected more. Okay. So percussion maneuvers. So just like you percuss, you can percuss the muscles by certain maneuvers. Like if you take a hammer, tomahawk hammer, that's a triangular hammer, and just percuss your deltoid or your thigh muscles, you can see a small dimple form, which is normal in individuals. This is known as percussion irritability. This can be normally seen in anxious people or otherwise normal children as well. Okay. So apart from percussion irritability, okay, it's not pathological. So percussion irritability is not pathological. I used to think that percussion irritability is probably a sign of myotonia. It's not like that. Some dimpling of muscles can be seen if you normally percuss directly over the muscles. Then what is percussion myoedema? This is interesting. Once you hit with a hammer directly over the muscle, instead of forming a dimple, it forms a small mountain-like hump. It forms a small mountain-like hump. That's known as myoedema. And this can be seen in hypothyroidism. I'll show you the video later. And what is percussion myotonia? This is seen in myotonic dystrophy, where if, as I told you, myotonia is impaired ability to relax. So if you hit on the thenar or hypothenar eminences, the hands go into contraction and they very slowly relax. I'll show you the video of this one. So what is contraction myotonia? You cause a specific muscle to undergo contraction, okay? And then you elicit a myotonia. The very simple example is you ask a patient to tightly clench the fist and keep on like that for 30 seconds and then release, okay? So there is a delayed release of the fingers. So this is because of a contraction myotonia. The other example is that you ask to tightly close the eyelids tightly for 30 seconds and then release. So there can be a contraction myotonia of the eyelids where he's not able to open the eyelids. Okay. So these are some percussion maneuvers. I got some videos. I could see this in YouTube. As you can see, a small hump being, again, I show you. So once there is a hit, there's a small hump which is seen. This can be seen in hypothyroidism, in uremia, and very rarely in certain muscle conditions. Okay. Like you can see a small hump. So this is a percussion myoedema seen in hypothyroidism, okay, Addison's disease, uremia, and so on. Right, and this okay, extreme degree of let me stop this. Extreme degree of myoedema with a muscle as if it is moving like a sea waves can be seen in a disorder called as a rippling muscle disease. This is again from YouTube, a very good video. This is a rare genetic muscle disease called rippling muscle disease or caveolonopathy. Very interesting. If the patient just contracts the ankle, as you can see, there will be a movement of the muscle, calf muscles. Very interesting. Like suddenly it moves like a rippling sea waves. Just observe the see this muscle. Very interesting. there is a rippling like movements. It's a type of a myoedema or a movement of the muscles, which is seen in calf muscles. It's seen in rare muscle conditions like cavulonopathy or a rippling muscle disease. Like this, yeah. Right, so percussion myotonia, even as you can see, a small tap over the thenar eminences, the hands has to be kept like this. The hands has to be kept over the table. You can see this is the way to do it. Hands has to be kept on the table, and a small tap over the thenar eminences causes a contraction of the thumbs. The thumb just raises up, and then there is a slow release of the muscle. So this is an example of percussion myotonia, where you can see in a case of myotonic dystrophy. Always examine the similar percussion myotonia in both the parents, both the father and the mother. Some of them can have this. Okay, right. So if you do a similar percussion myotonia over the tongue, you get two dimples over the side of the tongue, and this is called as a napkin ring sign. This is called as a napkin ring sign when you do a percussion myotonia over the tongue. And this is like a percussion myotonia of the hands, that there's a delayed hand grip. Okay, hand release. That's a delayed release of the hand grip. So now what are the maneuvers that we can do? We can do maneuvers, lot of maneuvers to check the tone and the power. I will, in this presentation, I will just restrict myself to the tone. The power and reflexes I'll do in the next session. So what are the maneuvers? Everything starts from R. So you can look for the range of motion, you can look for resilience, and you can look for reflexes. And once you do the range of motion, you understand whether there is hypertonia or hypotonia. And once there is hypotonia, you should always check for passive tone and active tone. Okay, there are further maneuvers for passive tone and active tone. So the first thing that we do in a maneuvers is that we check the range of motion. Just like we do in orthopedics, you flex, you extend, you abduct, you adduct, and you see whether the range of motion is restricted. You should start slowly and then you should do fast. You should always do right side and left side and compare the sides across different joints. Okay, the elbow, the wrist, the shoulder joints, the hip joints, the knee joints, and the ankle joints, so that you have a fair idea of the group of the muscles which are involved. This helps us to differentiate between spasticity, rigidity, and hypotonia. So these are the 5 maneuvers that we do in motor examination. Every student needs to remove that: range of motion, resilience or the power of the muscles, and the reflexes. Okay. So see, this is one good image of how we do. So one hand kept below the knee, other hold at the ankle. Just flex suddenly and rapidly and fastly. So do that very fastly. Okay, and then do it repeatedly. Okay, so this is the way that you check for spasticity. So if you get a catch in the initial part of the examination, so that is highly suggestive of a spasticity. Okay, so just always support the knee, and one hand at the knee and one hand at the ankle, and flex it rapidly. So if you're getting a catch, or it's called as a clasp knife phenomena, where just like a knife, the initial part will show some resistance and there'll be a sudden giveaway. This is highly specific or highly suggestive of spasticity. Right. So if the spasticity can involve certain groups and the other groups, for example, the upper limb flexors and the lower limb extensors are more involved. And in the case of a preterm child, the hip adductors, okay, are more involved, and this can cause your typical stiffening of the legs that you can see in a preterm child with spasticity. Whereas this rigidity, I already told you, decortication rigidity, where there is flexion at the level of the elbow and extension at the level of the legs, and decerebrate where there is extension overall. Okay, so there can be difference between spasticity and rigidity. At this point, it's just you have to go back and think what are the difference between spasticity and rigidity. So spasticity is velocity dependent. If I do very fastly, I'm able to appreciate spasticity. Rigidity is velocity independent. If I do slowly, I'm able to appreciate rigidity. Spasticity involves one group of the muscles, either the antagonist or the agonist. Rigidity involves both the group of the muscles, the agonist and the antagonist. Okay. So, and spasticity is accompanied by other signs like extensor plantar, clonus, and brisk reflexes. Rigidity may not be accompanied by other pyramidal signs. Okay, rigidity may not be accompanied by extensor plantar or clonus or Babinski sign. Okay, so the other localized rigidity that you can elicit is a nuchal rigidity or a meningeal signs. Okay, which in a particular situation like a headache and a child who's having irritability, you'll always check for neck rigidity, which is called as Brudzinski sign. So when you flex the neck, the hip flexes. Okay, it automatically elicits a hip and a knee flexion. This is called as Brudzinski sign, which checks the flexion of the neck or the nuchal rigidity. And if you flex the knee to 90 degree and flex the hip to 90 degree and slowly extend at the level of the knee, you have significant pain. Extension of the knee will cause pain, and this is known as Kernig sign. So Kernig signs and Brzezinski sign is a type of a localized rigidity due to meningeal irritation. Okay, and such signs can be elicited even in children with Guillain-Barré syndrome because of meningeal irritation. So the difference between spasticity is clasp-like phenomena, no clasp-like phenomena and rigidity. Instead, you can see a lead pipe phenomena, right? Can be generalized or can be focal, right? Clonus and hyperactive muscle stretch reflexes are seen in spasticity. No clonus is seen. Muscle stretch reflexes or DTS is not necessarily altered. You have a Babinski sign in spasticity. That is a normal plantar reflexes in the case of rigidity, right? And it tends to predominate in one set of muscles, either the flexors or the extensors, whereas rigidity involves both the group of muscles, both flexors and extensors. So you need to use some scales for objective documentations like modified Ashworth scale, Tardio scale, and dystonia rating scale. I'll just give a highlight about modified Ashworth scale for spasticity. I think by default, students should start using a modified Ashworth scale in their practice. So this will help us to follow up. So what happens to a spasticity at this particular point of time versus a spasticity after 6 months. Okay. So in a modified Ashworth scale, 0 is normal tone. Number 1 is when you get a catch and a release phenomena. Number 2, there is catch, but there is also a minimal resistance in the early part of the movement. And number 3 and 4 is very difficult or more spasticity. So in number 3, the limb can be flexed. You feel lot of spasticity, but still you can flex the limbs. And number 4 is that the limb cannot be moved. It has a significant increase in spasticity. You need a lot of power to flex the limbs. And whereas number 5 actually becomes rigid. Now it involves both the agonist and the antagonist. So rigidity is nothing but a very severe form of spasticity where both the agonist and the antagonist are involved, and the limbs is held either rigid in a flexion posture or rigid in an extension posture. So if you have a catch, that is the earliest type of spasticity, which is grade 1 modified Ashworth scale. If you are able to move the limb, it is grade 3. So this is very simple. If you are not able to move a particular limb, it is grade 4. So very simple. In exam, if you are able to move, it is grade 3. If you are not able to move, it is a grade 4 spasticity by modified Ashworth scale. So what are the maneuvers? So once you get hypotonia, once you get your range of motion, and if your range of motion is very easy, it is going easily all throughout, and there is no spasticity or no rigidity, automatically you know that there is a hypotonia. Now hypotonia, understanding hypotonia or floppy baby is not the concept of this particular presentation. All of you know there is hypotonia because of a brain lesion, spinal cord lesion, or a lower motor lesion. Okay, and babies are floppy. You have a floppy baby can be because of lower motor problem like muscle problem, nerve problem, or neuromuscular junction, or can be because of upper motor problem. Anyhow, once you have understood that the range of motion is increased and the muscle's resistance is reduced, there is hypotonia. The next step is that you have to do tests for passive tone and active tone maneuvers. Very, very important to practice this. By default, I think none of the students practice this because they sort of miss it in examination. What is passive tone? In a passive tone, the child is the patient is very passive. He just keeps quiet and you do some maneuvers very fast. Okay. Whereas in active tone, you do certain maneuvers and you see the response of the child or the patient. So what is passive tone? You can drop the head, you can drop the arms, you can drop the legs. These are all called drop test. Okay. For example, in head dropping test, I keep one hand behind the head of the patient, and with the other hand, I lift the head and drop it from above. And I see whether he's able to come down. Okay, generally children come down on their head. If they are able to resist that head dropping, there is probably some spasticity or rigidity in the truncal muscles. In the arm drop test, you abduct one hand at the level of the shoulder to 90 degree, okay, and you suddenly drop the arm. I repeat, you abduct one arm at the shoulder level and you drop the arm, okay. So normal response is that the arms will drop, but if there is a spasticity, it can hang in the air for some time, okay. This is called as arm dropping test, and that's a sign. If it comes down very slowly, it's called as Beck-Truss sign. Beck-Truss sign, okay. Very simple logical. You are just dropping a particular limb and seeing the response, whether it is coming normally or whether that it's coming very slowly or whether it is hanging in the air. Similarly, for pendulousness of leg, you ask the patient or the child to sit in the edge of the chair. You gently extend both the legs and drop both the legs together. Normal response is that both the legs will come back down. There may be some rhythmic movements of the legs, especially if there is a cerebellar disease. It's called as pendular knee jerks or pendular movement of the legs. But if the legs sort of hang in the air for some time, it means that there is probably an occult spasticity. And then all of you know, for a newborn or for very small babies less than 3 months, you have to check for the angles. You have to sort of, abduct the hips, see the angles in the popliteal fossa. These are called popliteal angles, adductor angles, and dorsiflexor angles. And you have to scarf sign. That is, you take the hand and wrap across the child like a scarf. So these are the maneuvers for passive tone, where the child or the patient is passive and you do certain maneuvers. Most of the maneuvers are dropping tests. You just take a limb and allow it to drop and see what happens. Okay. So passive tone, like, yes, this particular child has a frog-like posture. The upper limbs are abducted, the hips are abducted, and this is a scarf sign. You take the hand and wrap across the sheet. There is so much of hypotonia and hyperexcitability or hyperlaxicity that you're able to easily do the scarf maneuver. Okay. So in a normal term child, the elbow only just crosses the midline. It does not cross too much. So in a normal child, if the elbow crosses the midline too much, then there is a hypotonia. So how do you measure the popliteal angle and the adductor angle? There is a good video from YouTube.
Position.
I will run this video. It's a 5-minute video.
The foot at the sides with one hand.
So this is how you check for the popliteal
while
angle. It's
supporting
usually
the
90
side of the
degrees.
thigh with the other. Care is taken not to exert pressure on the hamstrings, as this may interfere with their function. The leg is extended until a definite resistance to extension is appreciated. In some infants, hamstring contraction may be visualized during this maneuver. At this point, the angle formed at the knee by the upper and lower leg is noted and the appropriate square is selected. It is important that the examiner wait until the infant stops kicking before extending the leg. The prenatal Frank breech position will...
So as you see that in all these maneuvers, actually the head should be kept in midline. So you can take the assistance of some other examiner or a friend and keep the head in midline and do the maneuvers. Otherwise, the maneuvers will give you false values.
Interfere with this maneuver for the first 24 to 48 hours of life due to prolonged flexor fatigue. The test should be repeated once recovery has occurred. Alternately, a score similar to those obtained for other items in the examination may be assigned. The scarf sign maneuver tests the passive tone of the flexors about the shoulder girdle. With the infant lying supine, the examiner with one hand supports the infant's head in the midline and the infant's hand just above the chest. The thumb of the examiner's other hand is placed on the infant's elbow. The examiner nudges the elbow across the chest, feeling for resistance to extension of the flexor muscles about the shoulder girdle. The point on the chest is noted to which the elbow moves easily prior to significant resistance. Landmarks noted in order of increasing maturity are full scarf at the level of the neck, contralateral axillary line, contralateral nipple line, xiphoid process, ipsilateral nipple line, and ipsilateral axillary line. The heel-to-ear maneuver measures passive flexor tone about the pelvic girdle by testing for resistance to extension of the flexor muscles at the hip. With the infant lying supine, the lower extremity is flexed at the hip so that it rests on the mattress alongside the infant's trunk. The examiner holds the infant's thigh alongside the body with the palm of one hand, avoiding pressure on the hamstrings so as not to interfere with their function. The other hand is used to grasp the infant's foot at the sides of the heel and to pull it toward the ipsilateral ear. Using the infant's heel as the indicator, the examiner feels for resistance to extension of the pelvic girdle flexors by noting the point on the body where significant resistance is appreciated. Landmarks noted in order of increasing maturity are when the heel easily reaches the level of the ear, the nose, the chin, the nipple line, the umbilicus, and the femoral crease. This concludes the neuromuscular portion of the assessment. Now, we will demonstrate the physical portion.
Yeah, hello. So this is some of the ways that you can do the Ballard score, but the neurological assessment includes popliteal angle, adductor angle, the heel to shin test. Okay, so this video is there available in YouTube. Some of them interested can see. Okay, so the square window measures the angle between the wrist at the level of the wrist joint. So what you should note is that in a preterm child it is more of 90 degree, whereas in a term child the square window is actually less than 15 degrees. Okay, so in case of hypotonias it would be reversed, like that, be more flexibility at the level of the wrist in a case of a preterm child as well. Okay, so you can measure these angles like square window. Dorsiflexor angle is similarly angle at the level of the ankle joint. So what are the measures you do for an active tone? For an active tone, the child does some maneuvers. So for example, you allow the child to respond to your maneuver. Okay, so and you, for example, the child here is very active, it responds to your interventions. So what we do in a newborn or a children less than 3 months is a 3-degree flip test. From the supine position, you make the baby sit, and then you make the baby stand, and then you put on the prone position. So this 3-degree flip test gives a fair idea about the tone control of the axial muscles and the appendicular muscles. So you have a pull to sit maneuver where you look for the neck muscles and the neck flexors and the neck extensors. You ventrally suspend the child by keeping your hands in the axilla, and you see the tone at the level of the hip girdle muscles, the pelvic girdle muscles, whether the child is able to move the legs. Okay, and that sign, if the child is able to flex the hips nicely, it's called as the Forrester sign, which means that the hip flexor strength is very good. And when you horizontally suspend your child, what you're looking for is the amount of head lag and whether the child is able to lift the head to the plane, to the level of the plane of the trunk. Okay, whether the child is able to lift the head to the level of the plane of the trunk. So all these maneuvers, the child is responding to your interventions, like the traction response by pull to sit maneuver. If the head is extremely lagging behind, you know that there's a significant degree of axial hypotonia. Similarly, in a horizontal suspension, if the back is very much rounded and if there is a significant head lag, you know that there is a very severe degree of axial hypotonia, which can be seen in floppy babies. In a ventral suspension, if you see that the movement at the around of the pelvic girdle or hip girdle is very weak, you know that there is a that is probably a peripheral hypotonia or a neuromuscular hypotonia. So the same maneuver in a child with SMA, where there is a axial hypotonia, okay, and there's a significant degree of axial hypotonia in this child with SMA. Okay, so this is the Forrester sign where I'm doing a ventral suspension of a child, and you can see that he would lift his hips. This means that there is a good hip flexor strength, and this baby, even though he's floppy, it automatically rules out your myopathy or neuromuscular junction disorders. As you can see here, there is a significant degree of axial hypotonia. There is a big head lag. Okay, but if you see his pelvic girdle strength is still good. So this is a case of a central hypotonia where the axial hypotonia, can you see his limb movements, the upper limb movements and lower limb movements are good. So in this case, the child is likely to have a central hypotonia or a central hypotonia and not a peripheral or a neuromuscular hypotonia. So this much difference is very, very essential at the level of examine for you to make whether it's a central or a peripheral hypotonia. So the idea is that once you understand, you know, whether it's an upper motor or a lower motor lesion, I think this will come when we try to localize after completing your power and reflexes. Okay. So what are the list of the signs that we have seen till this point? So from my initial slides, I told a lot of signs. For example, I told you Hercules body signs. Can you just recall, where did you see? Here I'm checking your short-term memory. So you can see a Hercules body sign or muscular generalized hypertrophy in a case of myotonia congenita. Where do you see Gower sign? You see a Gower sign in a case of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, right? Where do you see a hip abduction sign? Hip abduction sign you see in a case of a limb girdle muscular dystrophy like sarcoglycanopathy, where the hip abductors are good and the hip adductors are weak. Where do you see a diamond on a thigh sign? Again, you see in a limb girdle muscular dystrophy, especially dysferlinopathy, where there is an atrophy in the quadriceps muscle. Where do you see a calf and a head trophy sign? Again in a limb girdle muscular dystrophy where there is a focal atrophy of muscles. Where do you see Shank sign? Shank sign you see in a case of myotonic dystrophy where there is atrophy from the biceps, triceps and the distal forearm muscles. Where do you see Popeye sign? Popeye sign is because of atrophy of the biceps and hypertrophy of the forearm muscles you see in a case of facioscapulohumeral dystrophy. Polyhill sign is again where multiple muscles like the sternocleidomastoids and deltoid are hypertrophied. Again, a polyhill sign you see in a case of facioscapulohumeral dystrophy. Where do you see a napkin ring sign? If you percuss the tongue, you see a myotonia in the tongue muscles, and that you see in myotonic dystrophy. So a napkin ring sign is a percussion myotonia of the tongue. And what is this Froment sign? Okay, I didn't tell you about Froment sign. So if you go back to rigidity, okay, what is rigidity? So when I'm moving a limb slowly, I feel a resistance which is present throughout the range of the motion. So if I want to increase the rigidity, or if there is a very subtle rigidity, if I want to uncover the rigidity, what I can do is that I can move, I can ask the patient to move another limb, okay? And for example, I can ask the patient just to do no movement of the head. He keeps on doing no movement of the head. And then in the meantime, I check the rigidity. So doing some other movement will increase the rigidity. So this is very, very interesting Froment sign. And sometimes it is necessary to understand subtle Parkinsonism or subtle rigidity, especially in Wilson's disease and so on. So what I try to do is that I just ask the patient to do a no movement. It's very easy. And then you start eliciting for rigidity, and the rigidity can increase. So when you do an voluntary movement of one other side or other group of muscles, rigidity in other group of muscles increases. This is called as Froment sign. And all of you know Koenig signs. When you flex the hip and the knee and you gently try to extend the knee, there is increasing pain at the level of the back. That's called as Koenig sign seen in meningitis. Brudzinski sign, when you passively flex the neck, there is an increase in meningeal pain because of meningitis. What is Beckett-Truss sign? Beckett-Truss sign is your arm drop sign. You ask the patient to, lift the arm at the level of the shoulder and drop it, okay? Arm should easily drop. If it stays in the air, it can be seen in spasticity. It's called as Beckett-Truss sign. And Forrester sign, I just now showed you. When you do a ventral suspension, a child can flex the hip. That is called as Forrester sign. And Scarf sign is to see for the amount of strength of the flexors and the abductors in the shoulder girdle by pulling the hands across the midline, okay? Scarf sign is used for newborns and kids. So these are the list of the signs. I just sort of revised it again. It's not important that you know all the signs, but as you can understand, it's very interesting when you're looking for certain signs in neurology, okay? You are more able to appreciate the nuances in understanding the tone. So exam readiness, how would you how will you summarize till this point? Let me give an example of a myotonic dystrophy. So I would say you would present to the examiner, this child has a peculiar long faces with open V-shaped mouth. He is overall thin bed with symmetric muscle contour. No specific pattern of muscle group, atrophy or hypertrophy. This child has percussion myotonia noted over the bilateral thenar eminence tongue muscles. Interestingly, this percussion myotonia is also noted in the mother. Delayed relaxation of hand grip is noted. The range of motion is increased along the distal group of muscles, along with excessive flappability noted over the distal wrist and the ankle joints. He seems to have more distal more than proximal and appendicular more than axial hypotonia. So in presence of this particular pattern of weakness with this particular pattern of atrophy and percussion myotonia, I would like to think that this child has a myotonia dystrophy. So this is how you summarize your inspection findings, palpation findings and percussion findings. And of course, you would note that the power in the distal muscles is 2/5, whereas in the proximal muscles is 4/5 and so and so. And the reflexes are, minimally elicitable with the plantar flexor. So always go by the step, okay? It is observation or inspection followed by palpation, percussion and performing certain maneuvers. So this comes to my summary of my talk. So 3 things which I did discuss today was observation, and then palpation and percussion. And observation, look for general physical examination, the facies, the dysmorphic features, the skin, the laxity of the joints, the contractures, okay? The muscle group atrophies or hypertrophies, whether there is a generalized atrophy, whether there is a generalized hypertrophy, or very specific groups of muscles are involved, any asymmetry of involvement should be noted. How is the posture of the child, frog-like posture, hemiparetic posture, scissoring posture, so on. And when you feel the muscles, how are the muscles? And when you do a range of motion, how is the range of motion, okay? Is there a catch? Is there a uniform resistance throughout the range of motion? What is the modified Ashworth scale? Is it grade 3 that you are feeling the difficulty in flexing, but still you are able to flex the joint, or it is difficulty in flexing throughout the range of the joint, like the modified Ashworth scale grade 4? Okay. How is the active tone and how is the passive tone? Okay. And then you can comment about the power and the reflexes. Okay. So thanks for listening. So what I will do today is that I will send you a summary, one-pager summary. Okay. So these days I've started making a one-pager summary in an Excel sheet so that you can just, my entire presentation, the crux of the message would be that one-page summary. I've just now forwarded to the DM group WhatsApp. Okay. So yeah, so Kaleem, I'll just unmute you, and Jason sir also, sorry, I'll unmute. Is there any question?
Sir, actually one doubt, sir. Can you just explain like the Forrester sign? It is showing central hypotonia, axial hypotonia, and hypertonia and hypotonia, and like what was the interpretation, sir? I didn't get.
No. See, Forrester sign, Kaleem, is very simple. It shows that the child does not have neuromuscular weakness. That's all. That is interpretation. He is able to move his hip flexors. Okay. So in that child, child I showed in the video has a significant hypotonia. He is significant hypotonia, but he is not weak. His muscles and nerves are good. You understood? So he's having a central cause of hypotonia, like metabolic or genetic or a brain cause. So as you know, in a central hypotonia, the axial muscles are more involved than the appendicular muscles. So this is not a floppy baby discussion, but that is the message. Okay. In a floppy baby, in a central cause, the axial muscles are more involved than the appendicular muscles. Like it could be genetic or metabolic or brain or spinal cord. Okay. Whereas in appendicular hypotonia is more of neuromuscular. So a Forrester sign can very easily differentiate between a central hypotonia and a peripheral hypotonia. So I know this child is having central hypotonia. Means there is no neuromuscular hypotonia, no peripheral hypotonia. Okay. It rules out peripheral hypotonia. Okay. You would have seen it actually many times. I do this Forrester sign. It's very simple. You know, once I lift the floppy baby, I know, okay, probably the muscles is involved, nerves are involved or not involved. In this child, even though they will, for example, if this child is referred for a muscle biopsy or nerve conduction study, I may not do it because I'm very confident that the child is having a good hip flexor strength, you know, good anti-gravity movements. Yeah.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. Any other doubts?
Inspection.
Yes, sir. I gave a huge list of inspection actually. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned gait analysis.
No. Gait. I will, according to the scheme, I will go. As per the scheme, I mean, in the very first slide, I can just show that, sir. There are different ways where people put the gait. For example, in many systems, gait is given in the beginning. Sorry, I'll just do it again.
Because as the patient comes into the room,
yes, exactly.
First thing you see is the gait.
Exactly, sir. Agree. So let me here put an emphasis. Gait has to be seen in the beginning as well as in the end. Okay, sir. Gait here I put at number 7. But gait, you always make an opinion the way the child walks, how he walks and comes into you. So, but you can analyze the gait at the end. Even though you observe the gait in the beginning, you can analyze the gait in the end when you're doing cerebellar signs and test of coordination. That's easy that way to do. For example, you can do the Romberg sign, you can do the dysmetria, tandem walking, and cerebellar signs and the gait together in the end. So that's why I didn't go for the gait examination. Hello?
The other thing is, how do you